Welcome back. We're taking a closer look at a story that has captivated millions, and yet we believe that some stories must be challenged.
Even when they are as exquisitely crafted and as widely praised as Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet.
Exactly. We want to go beneath the beauty of the prose to really explore the moral architecture that's holding the whole story up.
And that's the mission today. This exploration is part of our continuing inquiry into how fiction can illuminate moral truth, human reasoning, and what we call ethical asymmetry.
Because fiction isn't just fantasy.
Not at all. Though it's imagined, it often acts as a kind of moral mirror, reflecting the rules and, really, the architecture of our own reality, the injustices we sometimes accept.
So we're providing you with the complete shortcut to understanding the critical conversation around this book. Our analysis isn't just a summary.
No, it's more like a structural test.
Right. We're using a structured, step-by-step, critical thinking approach. You can think of it as stress testing the narrative's logic. We're also using an intellectual ethics framework.
Which means we're testing the story against certain universal standards of fairness, things like the Golden Rule or the ideals you find in documents like the U.S. Preamble.
The call for justice and general welfare.
Exactly. And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM designed to provide deeper, more dynamic analysis. We want to bring the sharpest critical tools right to you.
So let's unpack this. Let's start with the core dilemma at the heart of the story. The question that I think drives O'Farrell's entire historical rebalancing act. What does this story claim about justice and meaning when a great historical figure's public art grows directly out of an unrecorded, private loss? What does it claim when innocence alone isn't enough to protect the innocent?
What's so fascinating here is the quiet revolution the book performs. It pushes back against that traditional historical narrative.
The one that only records public achievement.
Right. It demands that we recognize the moral weight of lives that were, by historical accident, just footnoted or completely forgotten.
The novel's mission here is, well, it's both ambitious and incredibly intimate. It takes these very scant, factual records of Hamnet Shakespeare's death in 1596.
Tiny scraps of information, really.
And from that, it reconstructs this whole emotionally dense domestic world of his family, specifically his mother, Agnes, who we all know as Anne Hathaway.
It fills in that vast, aching emotional gap in the historical record.
And this is where the book really delivers its central claim.
It really is. It argues for a massive historical rebalance. It insists that private grief and the often unseen act of caregiving, that they carry just as much moral and historical weight as public achievements.
And the way it does that is through imagery and this intense emotional logic.
Yes. It suggests that the great tragedy Hamlet matters, not because it caused Hamnet's significance, but because it acts as this sort of belated offering, a very human attempt to transform an irreplaceable absence into some kind of shared meaning.
So a great takeaway here is that the themes aren't just grief and loss.
No, they're all braided together.
You have gender dynamics, fate, and the ethics of historical attention, who gets remembered and who, as you said, gets footnoted.
Which is why critics so often praise the book. It foregrounds family, siblings, motherhood, and the incredibly fragile texture of everyday life under plague conditions in late 16th century England.
It's a radical shift of the historical spotlight.
That fragile texture is absolutely crucial. O'Farrell doesn't just invent a domestic scene, she gives it this monumental moral significance. She's arguing that the true cost of greatness is often paid quietly off stage by the people left behind.
Okay, let's turn that critical lens onto Agnes herself. We need to analyze her character through that ethical lens. The story centers her as a profoundly morally serious agent.
She is the moral anchor.
The narrative emphasizes her skill in care work, her knowledge of herbal healing, and her deep, almost spiritual intuition.
Exactly. And her very presence challenges the assumption that greatness is only attached to public male-coded achievements. Her moral arc is one of profound transformation. She begins with this kind of prophetic self-assurance, this deep connection to nature and her ability to protect her own. But she's forced toward this anguished humility when she's confronted by a loss she simply cannot prevent.
So she embodies courage, but also the limits of that courage.
Yes, the hard limits of human control when you're facing forces like disease and history itself.
And that transformation is so essential because it highlights the ethical asymmetry the whole narrative relies on. Now, for listeners who might not have encountered that term, what exactly does ethical asymmetry look like in this family setting?
Well, simply put, it's an imbalance of risk, of labor, and of recognition. The narrative sets up a really clear one.
With the husband.
With the husband, who we know is Shakespeare, he's often viewed indirectly, at a physical and emotional distance, right? He's driven by ambition toward London, toward fame.
Meanwhile, the family back in Stratford.
Particularly Agnes, they're the ones shouldering the daily labor, the primary caregiving, and the constant risk of survival, both economic and biological. She invests the moral capital, he reaps the public rewards.
But I want to push back a little there. Doesn't the book also show that the husband suffers from the separation and the loss, even if he benefits from the ambition? Is the narrative truly one-sided in its judgment?
That's a really intelligent challenge. And you're right, the narrative does acknowledge his pain. But if we apply our critical thinking frame, if we test the logic and check the fairness, we see the voice is deliberately structured to judge.
How so?
It privileges Agnes's interior world. It tends to judge patriarchal neglect and economic exploitation, like in the depiction of John Shakespeare, the father, much more harshly than it judges artistic ambition.
So there's a clear bias.
A clear narrative bias, yes. It champions domestic justice and care over public, market-driven success. The author uses this asymmetry to force us, the readers, to ask, what costs are too high for art?
And we can't forget the very real social constraints Agnes is facing. Her practical knowledge, her quasi-mystical insight.
Her connection to the natural world and healing.
Right. In that culture, in the late 16th century, that could so quickly be recoded as witchcraft or deviance. Her moral seriousness exists right on the edge of social acceptability and, frankly, personal danger.
Which just adds another layer to that asymmetry.
Okay, so that brings me to the imaginative world O'Farrell builds. She saturates the book with symbolic patterns. You've got herbs and gardens, animal presences, the metaphor of twinship, the plague's invisible pathways. How do these physical details become more than just decoration? How do they encode ethical vulnerability?
The symbolism is the book's intellectual backbone. These motifs aren't decorative at all. They are moral encoders. They suggest vulnerability, interdependence, the porous boundary between life and death.
Can you give an example?
Sure. When the story describes the plague, it's not just some abstract force. The contagion follows the specific movements of trade, of people, of cloth. It's both organic and systemic, showing how human commerce and movement can actually facilitate disaster.
And what's fascinating here is this specific focus on the twins, Hamnet and Judith. They almost act as living symbols.
They do. They highlight a philosophical paradox. Interchangeability and irreplaceability, both at the same time.
What does their bond suggest about the nature of loss?
Their bond is absolutely key to the book's profound ethical statement. It suggests that while, yes, in the wake of tragedy, life must continue and others might step into the practical roles of the lost, a life cannot simply be substituted.
Even when the plot explores that idea.
Right. The book explores substitution in life and in art, but ultimately it rejects the notion that the unique, specific life of Hamnet can be replaced, not by his sister and not by the play named after him.
Emotion in this story really functions as a powerful form of reasoning.
It does.
Fear, guilt, and this profound grief. They drive character choices that might not be strictly rational, but they are entirely morally legible within the fictional world. They make sense to us as readers because O'Farrell has established the intent stakes.
And that ties directly into the narrative logic. The fictional world obeys a very consistent ethical logic. The consequences of absence or negligence or moral blindness are not random events.
They flow from character.
They flow inevitably from character and from the immense constraints of 16th century social structures. If a character acts selfishly, something of value has to follow, in the form of emotional cost or consequence. The novel isn't letting its characters off the hook.
This feels like a perfect point for reflection, a moment to step back and ask the critical question the book is really inviting us to ask.
Which is,
does art ever truly make up for a child's death? Or is that desire itself ethically suspect?
It's a tough question. The novel gently suggests that while a great work can transform private grief into a kind of shared understanding, giving it a civic and artistic scope, it can't erase the fundamental, intimate asymmetry
between the playwright's fame and the child's anonymity.
The anonymity imposed on the child who inspired him, it can't be erased.
This kind of reflective question is exactly what we champion at Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. We try to keep this kind of rational reflection alive.
And it's also incredibly valuable for aspiring authors, I think, to see how a masterpiece can push its audience to really feel the moral cost of a narrative transformation.
Shifting to the societal reflection, The novel sketches a really vivid historical picture of life in Stratford. It goes far beyond the pastoral ideal.
It does. It details the economic precarity of the glove-making trade and the severe gendered constraints on women's autonomy.
And the book uses the plague's spread almost as a socio-economic critique.
Yes, an acute one. It follows the chain of contagion across trade routes and into specific households to expose precisely how ordinary people, the ones with less of an economic buffer, bear the immediate and brutal brunt of systemic vulnerabilities they did not design.
So it shows that public health is tied to class.
Inextricably linked to class and trade in this world.
And if we relate that intense moral tension to transcendent principles,
Yeah.
Looking through the lens of the Golden Rule or the U.S. preamble's ideals of justice and general welfare, the book exposes a clear ethical failure.
It does. It shows how profoundly unprotected children, women, and the poor were by the social order of the time. There was no mutual care built into the social structure.
It implicitly contrasts that historical reality, where a father can pursue glory while his family lives with instability and patriarchal control.
With an aspirational ideal of shared responsibility and mutual care. Philosophically, the book leans toward a humanist and, I'd say, a somewhat existential outlook.
How so?
Death is treated as final, meaning must be constructed by the living. And art is seen as this fragile but necessary response to mortality. It fundamentally questions any simplistic providential narrative.
It insists that meaning is wrested from catastrophe.
Through human effort, the message is clear. We can't just rely on fate or providence. Meaning requires human agency and ethical choice.
So in terms of an analytical synthesis, how does it all hold together?
The book's internal coherence is exceptionally strong. Its reasoning is, well, it's predominantly ethical and emotional rather than strictly argumentative. It appeals to the heart. But the values it dramatizes, care, loyalty, responsibility, are consistently embodied in character and in the plot's development.
And as a literary achievement, its praise is clearly well-deserved. It's widely celebrated for its lyrical prose, the immersive period detail, and its incredibly powerful depiction of familial love and consuming grief.
It really does provide a compelling imaginative bridge between the archival Shakespeare we know and the intense, complex emotional world that might have surrounded the creation of Hamlet.
But we do have to address the limitations, the ethical questions.
We do. The very intensity that makes the book so successful, its fierce interiority, its highly descriptive style, can at times feel a little indulgent to some critics. Moreover, the strong centering of Agnes's viewpoint, while morally restorative, can overshadow the perspectives of others.
Including Hamnet himself.
Including Hamnet himself, potentially simplifying the complexity of their grief. This raises a really important question, one we might frame using a critical reader's lens.
And that is?
Does the author do justice to the complexity of real human experience, or does the aesthetic effect risk sentimentalizing it?
And that distinction between complexity and sentimentality, that is the key takeaway for any critical reader. Without revealing any pivotal scenes or outcomes, the lasting lesson of the book is that the small lives behind these canonical works. They aren't small at all.
Not in the slightest.
They are the essential moral ground from which those works grow. The novel ultimately leaves you with this enduring image of private grief that's been transformed, not healed or solved by art, as if the stage becomes a civic space where private loss can finally meet a collective witness.
So the invitation for a critical reader is twofold. To feel profoundly with this family, yes, but also to question how stories, both historical and fictional, allocate attention, glory, and blame.
And they ask a very modern question.
And perhaps most importantly, to ask whether our own culture still unconsciously sidelines caregivers, children, and the socially marginal in favor of marquee names and public success.
Click the link on screen to subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally about how stories shape conscience, one novel at a time.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.